This is Jean Lithgow, and I'd like to welcome you to, this is actually not the first time I've done this one. I originally did April 30th, but this is our virtual lunch and learn. And tonight's topic is the Mafia in Rockford, from bootleggers to retirees. As Andrew said, there will be questions at the end. So what happened was the Volstead Act was in force January 17, 1920 through December 5th, 1933. Most of us know it better as prohibition. It forbade the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquor. It did not prohibit the drinking of intoxicating liquor. And homeowners had special exemptions. Section 29 of the Volstead Act allowed 200 gallons, which is about 1,750 milliliter bottles of non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice to be made at home each year. So that gives you quite a bit of leeway there. There were also a number of exemptions and exceptions in the law. Unfortunately, many of those were intended to evade the law's original purpose. For example, the act allowed a physician to prescribe whiskey to his patients, but did limit the amount that could be prescribed. A couple of other things. Vintners such as the Christian Brothers could continue to produce wine for communion. And it was amazing the number of small churches that suddenly sprung up to apply for that exemption. Many of us know the name Martinelli. We may have bought a lot of apple juice for our kids over the years. And during Prohibition, Martinelli's went from producing hard cider to non-alcoholic cider. Their signature apple-shaped bottles were introduced in 1933, for a little bit of trivia there. Okay, the doctors who were writing prescriptions for whiskey, but it was the druggists who filled the prescriptions, and this was considered a very good source of income for the druggists. And here's a list of druggists in Rockford from the 1920 McCoy's Rockford City Directory. And we had quite a few druggists. I do see they're still there at 302 West State Street. Many of us know that corner. There were a lot of other names there that look good to people. And you might know them from something your parents said. Okay, now bootlegging was just one part of the mob's activities. Illegal gambling, prostitution, and taking money for protection, that is extortion, were others. There are stories about boats on the Rock River that were laden with illegal alcohol, but I haven't yet found any proof of that. No pun intended. The illegal gambling was very popular in Winnebago County. There are newspaper articles in the 1950s about the sheriff's men raiding taverns that had illegal gambling on almost everything. Okay, one of the jobs the sheriff's men had to do would be to break up stills and places where illegal alcohol was being manufactured. This was a still deluxe, supposedly owned by Frank Zamata, but it was located at the home of Charles Ciccano at 825 Morgan Street. The house is no longer there. It's part of a parking lot now. This is an article from the Rockford Daily Register Gazette, January 4, 1921. And you can see there's quite a bit. There's the still itself, other containers, some demijohns that probably held the material. Frank Zamato was actually arrested just a few blocks away from there as he was delivering his produce by buggy. Okay, then we get into some of these sadder and more serious parts. Louis J. Milani was murdered, and the feeling is that this was a gang-related murder. The Rockford Republic covered the story October 5th, 1923, and it's pretty gruesome. It says man's head almost slashed from body. He was actually found in a culvert with a 100-pound rock on top of him, and his throat was cut so deeply that his head was nearly decapitated. This picture shows the culvert where the body was found with an X marking the spot. This young man, really a boy, George Minert, discovered the crime while he was out looking for insect specimens. That was probably a sight he never forgot. Okay, and here are some of the details. There were 15 knife or razor slashes on the face and hands on a rope around his neck. 2 murder suspects were taken in, Joseph Dana and Gerlando Raman, who were roommates with Milani, and they were rooming at the Joseph Mera home. Both suspects were grilled until midnight by State's Attorney William Johnson and his assistant Robert E. Nash, and you might recognize the Nash name. And then they were taken for the grand jury. And a number of Italian friends and acquaintances of Milani were also summoned to appear before the grand jury. His watch was missing, and there were only a few links left attached to his vest. So they feel that robbery was the motive. Some of his friends said that he was expecting a considerable sum of money and was going to purchase an automobile. So the feeling was that he received the money and then was murdered and robbed. This was a few days later, Rockford Republic, October 8, 1923. They never solved this murder. A few years later, Tom PERRA was found murdered in February of 1928. The headline is Police Spotter Found Slain. Well, a police spotter was someone who went into the gang, infiltrated the gang, and then reported back to the police. So some people called him a spotter. Some people called them stool pigeons. Tom PERRA had been a liquor inspector with the police and had just recently turned his equipment in and then becomes a spotter. So they found the body in the woods near New Milford. The first picture, you can see the body there. You can see the body in the second picture as well. And then a few feet away, they found the murder weapon. So again, no one knew who did that. Someone who was working with him said that PERRA was really terrified. They were working out of Freeport at this point. So apparently PERRA was beginning to feel that the gang members were on to him. The Daily Republic, February 6th of 28, says that he's apparently intended as the warring factions were fighting. He was also known as Tom Reda, R-E-D-A. And so they took him for a ride. His head had been crushed repeatedly by blows from a blunt instrument, and 4 shots fired into the right side of his head. He had been living on Winnebago Street and recently had moved elsewhere. And he had been around the police station for days. But again, he was murdered. He probably had some information that would put some people in jail. And again, this murder was never solved. There's some interesting things. He left a widow who had given birth the day before to their 5th child. The newspaper found a picture of the 4 older children and an earlier photo of Tom and his wife taken with one of the young children. The caption down here The picture was found by the efforts of the police as well as the visiting nurses who had come to the home to help take care of the children. So at that point, newspapermen really had no problem going through people's papers to find the information they wanted. They wouldn't be able to do that today. So times have changed. But it was a very sad event. And here's poor Mrs. Perra. 5 children. What's she going to do? Well, that was in 28. By 1930, things were really heating up. Tommy Abbott, whose name had originally been Abbattini. This was probably a case because he was trying to be an up-and-coming person, and he felt that using the name Abbattini was maybe too long. Maybe some people felt it had negative connotations, so he was going by Tommy Abbott. He was from Chicago and was suspected of having killed the Chicago gangster Joe Zutto up in Wisconsin. He'd come to Rockford and his life was in danger. And what happens is that instead, Joe Giovingo was killed by mistake. Joe was out talking to some policemen and the car came by and shot Giovingo by mistake. Very sad. This is Tony Abbott, who was the intended target. There are some interesting photographs here. This shows there's a new sedan, they said that. Apparently, they just fired out the back window, breaking the window as they were shooting at who they thought was Abbott and instead was Giovingo. There's some more shots with the police department pointing out things there. And I think the thing that was most interesting is that the Rockford newspaper, the Register Gazette, was proud to report that they had an extra edition out on the street within an hour of the shooting. So you didn't have television then, you did have radio, but still the newspaper was the big medium of the day, and you're pretty glad they'd gotten those stories out. You can just see the policeman or the newspaperman running into the news tower saying, "Stop the," or something like that. This is the intersection of South Main and Morgan Streets, a contemporary image from Google. And this would have been where Giovingo was shot down. The streets would have been narrower. They would have only been 2-lane streets. But this gives us a contemporary feel for what happened back then. There was an unconfirmed story that Al Capone called Joe Giovingo's mother to apologize because he was probably the person who ordered the shooting and they got the wrong guy. So he did do that. Okay, Paul Giovingo, his brother, was murdered in February of 1933. This was a gang shooting. Paul Giovingo was found with a gun in his hand, but he hadn't had time to fire it. Well, this murder occurred in the 1200 block of South Winnebago Street between Loomis and Montague. So up here at the north end, or the left side of your picture, is the building that formerly housed Sunlit Dairy. It wasn't built yet, but this is kind of a building that part of town knows very well, and so I'm including it for perspective. And then at the other end of the block is the Montague Branch Library. I would imagine when the librarians came to work the next day, they were pretty upset to learn what had happened so close to where they worked. Okay. And then here's a black and white shot of the Sunlight Dairy when it first opened in November of 1936. It was designed by a well-known Rockford architectural firm, Bradley and Bradley, and was owned by Joseph J. Zito. You can see that there was also a gasoline station there. So it was a pretty hopping place. And here is a picture of Joseph Zito. He was actually born in Italy, lived in Springfield before he came to Rockford. After he died in 1981, he was named an unindicted conspirator in a Milwaukee extortion case. So they seem to feel that he, even though he had this really nice dairy and all that perhaps he had some less than savory associations. Okay, backing up just a little bit, in 1932, actually in December of 31, several men were released from Leavenworth prison. There were 10 men from Rockford that had been sent to Leavenworth to serve time. Jack DeMarco was one of them. He was released late December of 1931 and killed in January of 32. There was a homecoming party in his honor. 3 men broke in pretending to be police officers, and they just gunned him down right in front of everybody. Very sad, very sad. The feeling was that some people thought he'd maybe squealed to the federal agents, and since they couldn't prove it one way or the other, I guess they felt that this was the retribution they needed to do. Okay, police officer Ed Ring served on the police force from 1920 to 1943, and he had a number of interesting stories to tell about his career. One of the most interesting is the time he arrested Al Capone. So one day, his snitches had a particularly hot tip, and Ring's familiar location was directing traffic at State and Main Street. And the snitch says, "Don't turn around and look, but the man they're looking for in Chicago, he's in that crowd over there." And Ring said that he asked him one thing: "What color suit does he have on?" And he said it was a checkered suit. So Ring walked over and tapped the guy on the shoulder and said, "You're under arrest. Come with me." He didn't put up any fight. He just let me take him in. And then we have an article of a photograph of Al Capone. The Northwest Quarterly magazine in the summer, fall 2019 did a nice article on prohibition in general. And so this was a photograph of Mr. Capone. Okay, prohibition ended in 1933, but the gang members continued their activities. The first gangland killing after the end of prohibition was that of Louis COLLO in April of 1934. His granddaughter actually contacted me about 2 days before I gave my presentation on April 30th and gave me a little bit of information about it. And I did some digging around and to research to see what I could find, and was able to include this information in this talk. So it was kind of interesting to have someone tell me about that, sort of tell me. But DeColo was a tavern keeper on Kishwaukee Street. At that point, the tavern was in Winnebago County, outside of the Rockford city limits. And DeColo, his wife, and their 3 daughters lived next door. And then Angelo Buscemi attempted extortion, and when his men came for the money, DeColo was ready. DeColo was shot and fired and injured Buscemi. DeColo died, and his wife in the bedroom was also shot. Buscemi was later found in his car just outside of St. Anthony's Hospital. The assumption is that his men had driven him there and they'd left because they couldn't get involved in that. So in this photo, we see them pointing to the porch where the body was originally found. And then there's a paper has a nice photo. Okay, the tavern is here on the right. The house they lived in is on the left of the photograph. At that point, the address was 3005 Kishwaukee Street. This dotted line shows where COLLO left the tavern and walked over to his house, up the steps to the door, which is where he was shot. Mrs. COLLO was over here in the bedroom. Then D is where the car was parked that had the people in them. And the arrow here is where COLLO, one of his shots fired and landed on the tree. So you may not have had television in those days, but between the photograph and the captions, this is just as graphic as any news story you could see on television today. Now, what happens is Angelo Buscemi is in the hospital. They're thinking that he's going to recover. He is charged with the attempted murder, with the murder of Louis COLLO, but Buscemi develops pneumonia and dies. He was considered the head of a gang engaged in extortion, and COLLO had refused to pay. So that's another case. This is a case of where Buscemi is accused of the murder, but dies before he's brought to trial. And both the Winnebago County Sheriff's Department and the Rockford Police Department worked together on this case. And guess what? Ed Ring was one of the detectives working on it. Okay, I heard this story from the granddaughter, and I'm going, oh dear, here's poor Mrs. COLLO. She's got 3 kids to raise. What's going to happen to her? Well, I had to go back and do a little more digging. And what I learned about I did a little digging on the family. Louis COLLO immigrated to the United States from Italy in 1914. The 1930 census said he came in 1916, but that's within 2 years, and that's not a problem. He came with his family, and he was about 14 at the time. He owned the Kishwaukee Tavern and was murdered. And as I said before, first gangland killing afterwards. So for fun, I looked at the 1930 census, and here's Louis and his wife Angelina and the 3 daughters. In 1930, he's working as a miner, and the wife and girls are at home doing other stuff. Angelina was also born in Italy. There's the 3 daughters. Okay, so I looked ahead to the 1940 census because I'm going, oh dear, what's happened now? Things are going okay. Angelina, of course, is the head of the household right here. She is a tavern owner and is running a public tavern. The 3 daughters are with her, so that's good. And look here, her brother Pete, the name is variously listed as El Castillo or Aristides, and I have not had a chance to find out for sure what the real name is, but he's working at the tavern as the barman. So that's kind of encouraging. It's good that she was able to keep her family together and that her brother was able to come and help them. So that was a little more cheerful than some of the stuff here. And there is still a tavern at that location. So apparently it's been a good site for people to make money if you don't get murdered. We have a bit of a timeline here. 1923, Louis Milani is killed. 1928, Tom PERRA is killed. 1930, Joe Giovingo is killed. The 10 members of Leavenworth were being released. January of 32, Jack DeMarco is killed. February of 33, Paul Giovingo, Joe's brother, is killed. And then April of 34, Louis COLLO was murdered. So this is a very sad time in Rockford history. A lot of people were hurt by a lot of this. Jumping ahead a bit, in 1984, the Rockford Register-Star published articles on the Mafia in Rockford. Tom Schaefer did the majority of the articles. Artist Frank Fiorello was still on the newspaper staff at that point. Some of us may remember when Frank had his pumpkin patch out Highway 173, and people would go there with their kids and enjoy the maze and have a good time in the fall. So Frank did this really interesting illustration showing a hand. But they feel that the local underworld is a simple network, and it goes back to times of economic need in the past. And that was the first article. There were others. I'm not going to show you all of them. Within a day or two, a lot of people were annoyed. The Italian community was very annoyed because they felt that the stigma was applied to all Italians where there were only a few people. You wouldn't accuse, if a small group was doing something, it's unfair to accuse the entire group of having done something wrong. You just need to deal with the people who are causing the problem. Representative, the legislator, Zeke Georgie, was serious because the question isn't funny about people being called mafia. Frank St. Angel, another person who would be prominent in the Rockford area, Matt Cicero, Mary Mizuraka, and others were upset by the articles, and we're glad that the paper did print that side of the story too. The early story listed the former Black Hawk Bottling Company was part of the holdings of Joseph P. Zamuto, who had been identified as a longtime head of organized crime in Rockford. Well, the trouble is there were two Joseph P. Zamutos in Rockford, and you can't mix them up. The gentleman who owned the Black Hawk Bottling Company was never identified with organized crime. He and his brother started the firm in 1924, and they ran the business as family until 1973, when Graf's Beverages of Milwaukee, Wisconsin bought it. Joseph P. Zamuto, who owned the Blackhawk firm, died in 1974, and his family made sure to point out that in addition to his business activity, he was a member of the Rockford Selective Service Board during World War II. And the Register Star regrets the misidentification. So this means when you're doing research, you want to check and recheck, because you don't want to be hurtful, really. One of the things that they said, although I never really saw it in print, was that one of the reasons in maybe the 50s and 60s that crime was low in Rockford, because for some of the mafia from Chicago, that they settled in Rockford as a retirement area. And we do find a couple examples of that. Joseph Zito might have been one of them. And then when drugs started moving into the area, the Italian gangsters just didn't want any part of that. They could see how bad that could be, and they decided that was not something they wanted to worry about. Again, just check and recheck your resources. Okay, can I back up one? Previous, I don't want to go there yet. Okay, this is the main thrust of it. It's a sad story in Rockford history, but it seems to be a story that captures people's imaginations, and I'm not quite sure why. But let me at least mention before we go to the questions that don't forget to join us Thursday, May 14th from 12:30 to 1:30 on the next virtual Lunch and Learn. And then Kathy Kressel will be talking about Rockford's Dark Days Prohibition. Have you ever wondered about the dark underside of Rockford history? So hers will be a different account than mine, and Kathy's always great fun to listen to. So if you haven't signed up already, I suggest you do. And Andrew, shall we see if there's any questions out there?
Okay, great. So if you have questions for Jean, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask her, or utilize the chat feature and she'll do her best to answer your questions.
Any questions?
Well, I have a question because my cousin from North Carolina called me and I went to tell her I couldn't talk to her. Just when you were talking about where the library was on Montague, on Winnebago between Montague and Loomis, what happened there?
That's where Paul Giovingo was murdered on the block on the South Winnebago on the block between Loomis and Montague. And I can just imagine when the library staff went in the next morning, they must have really been shocked to find that that was happening so close to their workplace.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
Not a question, but the Ramona Avenue one, I'm wondering if that matches with a story. There's a family story of ours that my grandpa told some guys who had a guy who was shot on our side of the road in our yard and told him to get the hell out because he didn't want any of that stuff in our property. And we live right by Ramona. I wonder if that was where it was.
I don't know. I don't know. And that could be someone else entirely.
Could be. Because I think maybe the story is that like he was shot and maybe he was killed, but Grandpa didn't want this body over on our side because we had nothing to do with this kind of stuff. But there were bootleggers over on the other side of this, over on the side streets and down the street.
Okay, that's exciting.
My neighbors, it may be, I don't know if it's Ramona. It's one of the little streets. It may be Ramona here. At the end of the street, the people who live there, they wanted to build a garage. And when they dug out for the garage, they found, I saw it, the still. I mean, there was these big copper things and all the stuff. They found a still over there. So, yeah, it was going on around this neighborhood.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Well, I did have somebody ask me one time, they said there was a tunnel out by their garage, and she wondered if it was part of the Underground Railroad. And I did some research and said no. Plus, Rockford was such an abolitionist town that they wouldn't have let anybody be taken back into slavery if they could at all help it. And after I talked to her, I got to thinking that this was probably a tunnel for hiding bootleg material, particularly when she told me that her landlord had said, "Don't talk about this." So that's just my guess, but that's.
Well, down by this little street, there was a tunnel too. I never saw it, but my cousin, who was like 8 years older than me, when he was a kid, they saw the tunnel and it went between two different houses or two different places on the little street that I'm talking about. And he said his two buddies actually went through it and came out the other end, but he said it was so crumbly, he wasn't taking any chances on getting, scrunched by things falling. So that would have been from then.
Yeah.
The same street I'm talking about. There was stuff going on down there.
Okay. I just keep thinking about how much liquor was, or non-alcoholic cider was allowed for the 200 gallons that everybody could make in their house. And I'm going, that's a lot of processing. How can you drink that much up in a year's time?
Well, maybe you sell some of it.
You're not supposed to.
You have friends over for house parties.
They probably did. I'm sure there were a lot more parties than people do today. Any other questions, comments, suggestions?
I put a message in the chat area for a question for you.
Oh, where'd it go? Andrew, where am I going to find that?
Let me see if I can read it for you.
Okay.
Is there any mafia connection in Rockford now? Is one. And then there is a comment. I once heard a story that after the drug gangs came in to Rockford, a Zamuto Cadillac car was stolen. They were encouraged to return the car by the Chicago Mafia, and the car had been returned.
Well, I hadn't heard that story, but it would make sense. And I don't know if there's any mafia still in Rockford. I would imagine that most of the men who would have been active in the 20s and 30s are have died. Whether there's anybody still doing anything, I don't know.
I can't read the last comment exactly, the second sentence.
Yeah, I can't quite make it out either. It's in 1949 in Ogle County, Joseph Bergala of Cicero bought a farm. The maker of something, I can't quite make it out. Canadian booze planes flew through, so maybe there was some Canadian whiskey that came through town.
It could have, but it would have been legal by then. But there are a lot of interesting stories out there. I read a book once about a town in Iowa that was so poor during the Depression, they started making apparently a very good whiskey. And apparently just about everybody in the town was involved in it in some one way or another. But that wasn't Rockford. That was Iowa.
There was probably lots more going on that isn't in your story here, but we don't know about it.
I know, and I've tended to stick with the printed word. Someone said to me, "Oh, you need to talk to all those old nanas that are still around there." And I'm going, when I do research, I like to stick with the parts I can find, the written parts, because that's the way I like to do my research.
Yeah, all the good stuff is in family stories, but then you don't know, just like the story about my grandpa telling him to get the hell off our property. He didn't want to be messing around with that kind of stuff. and that they did it. They took the body or the guy had been shot off our property. It's like,
Well, that was good. Yeah. Glad they listened. I know. Wow. That's a
you
good
know,
story.
the next house up the road from me towards Rockford, there's a field in between. But I talked to the guy who had bought that after the Prohibition time, and he said he was told by some people that it had been used as like a safe or a hiding place for people in the mob. And that he didn't really believe it till they were remodeling up in there's like an attic kind of story, but it's not just an attic, you know. They were doing something and broke through a wall and there was a bathroom hidden up there.
Oh.
So he's pretty sure it is true that there was a hiding place for somebody to hide up there. And that's just just a little bit across the street on Montague from where the Ramona is. I mean, it's just like there was just all over here. That's why it was like live and let live. We had our farm here and there was this other stuff going on nearby, but you know, live and let live. Get off our property. We don't have anything to do with this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It was safe. It was safer to do it that way. Yeah. Right.
Thanks. This was interesting.
Okay. And I don't want you to think that the library only thinks about prohibition. I do know that I do want to remind you this coming Thursday, that Kathy Kressel will be talking about prohibition again, 12:30 to 1:30. If you can sign up the same way. The next 2 Thursdays after that, The 21st, I'm going to be doing one on genealogy from home when your library is closed, what you can do without using the Rockford Library card. And the second session on May 28th, I'll be talking about if you have a Rockford Library card, what sources you can use to utilize our databases that you might not want to spend all your monies on. So just feel free to go in and sign up for any of these. And I know Kathy's going to be a lot more fun. So yeah, she's so good. And then if you want to do some genealogy work, we've got that coming up the 21st and 28th. Anything else? Well, I guess we're going to finish up early then. Andrew?
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And once again, this will be, or has been recorded, excuse me, and will be available at a later date on library social media and or the library website if you want to check it out once again. And with that, I thank everyone for attending, and we will now end the meeting. Thank you.